In Jesus' name, amen. All right, our first presenter is Ivan James, and the title of his thesis is Redeeming Science. So please welcome Ivan.
Hello there. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. God set this pattern forth at the very beginning, at the creation. Ever since then, God's people have labored and done their work for 6 days and rested on the seventh. God is a God of patterns and instructs us to discover the patterns he has set up and incorporate them into our lives. One pattern God set up for us to perform is a process of education. God, by making us in his image, gave us the ability to discover. He instructs us to embrace and utilize this gift. As Proverbs 18:15 says, "An intelligent heart acquires knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge." Ever since the first students, Adam and Eve, received training and instruction, humans have studied and learned and understood and taught from generation to generation. We have discovered and created, growing from immaturity to understanding. Proverbs 1:5 says, "Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance." God made humans scientific creatures. This means that we are curious and seek to make discoveries. Proverbs 25:2 says, "It is the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings is to search things out." Therefore, since we are all heirs to the kingdom of God, it is not only our duty, but our glory to discover and learn. But we can understand nothing more than what God allows us to. God controls all flow of information and comprehension in the brain. We find the truth in two ways: by using evidence and logic, which are gift from God, and secondly, through revelation. Because of our humanity, our logic and evidence will always contain flaws, but the things which God reveals to us will not. God reveals the truth to us through his word and through his creation. According to God, we must study his creation. In doing so, we obtain glory for ourselves, and, more importantly, we give glory to God. He created a marvelous world, and with every discovery within its boundaries, we gain a greater understanding and respect for him. Psalm 111:2 says, "Great are the works of Yahweh, studied by all who delight in them." Those who truly rejoice in God's marvelous acts study them. Science is an intrinsic element of humanity. We cannot ignore it. Science has a heavy influence on modern culture, but it is being misapplied. God commanded us to study the whole creation, which entails more than just the physical world. Modern science has become exclusively materialistic. With the rise of Western culture, belief in scientism has spiked. Scientism is the view that the hard sciences, like chemistry, astronomy, biology, and physics, provide the only genuine knowledge of reality, and its believers uphold this view with religious fervor. As Christians, we know that all knowledge comes from God, and therefore, scientism directly rejects God. Unfortunately, the vast majority of people today, including us Christians, accept the ideas and implications of scientism. The modern understanding of science can be described as a systematic method of gaining knowledge about the universe by allowing only naturalistic and materialistic explanations and causes. As scientific Christians, we must not only look to the data acquired from experiments for our understanding of the world. Science encompasses much more than just measuring and experimenting. The word science comes from the Latin word scientia, meaning knowledge. Science means all of God's knowledge, which is infinite and unending, and therefore, so is science. Those who have let materialistic science pervert their view of creation believe that science is nothing more than an endless road that they hope will make life easier now. It is a self-serving process that advances their power over the natural world. But this power will remain unobtainable forever because the facts of science constantly shift. The American philosopher Thomas Kuhn explains the nature of these shifts in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. He divides the cycle of scientific views into three distinct stages: pre-science, normal science, and revolutionary science. These three stages form a perpetual pattern of understanding that humans constantly cycle through. Kuhn defines pre-science as the stage where a scientist makes an observation and begins to investigate it. Pre-science has no theory or foundation to back it up and is merely based upon the scientist's perception of reality. Normal science is established on the assumption that the scientific community understands the ways of the world, and scientists will work hard to defend this assumption. Normal science is the science we see and use at the moment. Kuhn defines it as research firmly based upon one or more past scientific achievements that some particular scientific community acknowledges for a time as supplying the foundation for its further practice. These achievements must have unprecedented distinction and influence to attract a large group of believers and keep people away from competing views. Kuhn would call these achievements paradigms. The road to a paradigm begins with an inquiry. The inquiry is approached with a random collection of mere facts. Many different researchers confronting the same problems will interpret and describe them in different ways, based on their personal biases. Eventually, these divergences will disappear, and one paradigm will rise to acceptance. As a paradigm grows in strength and numbers, the previous paradigms fade. Kuhn says, to this end, normal science often suppresses fundamental novelties because they are necessarily submersive of basic commitments. The scientific community will cover up any anomalies or new information to defend its reputation. But due to the nature of normal research, these scientific novelties will not remain suppressed for very long. Thus begins the scientific revolution. Kuhn defines a scientific revolution as a non-cumulative developmental episode in which an older paradigm is replaced in whole or in part by an incompatible new one. In other words, it's a widespread shift in scientific views from one commonly understood view to another, less common one. Ultimately, people will take sides, either in favor of the new institution or against it. In the end, the side that will come out on top will be the side that masters the techniques of mass persuasion. Most people will fail to notice these scientific revolutions. This oversight occurs for two reasons, the first of which is the fact that paradigm shifts are generally not viewed as revolutions, but rather as additions to scientific knowledge. The other reason is that the history of science represented in new scientific textbooks generally favor the new paradigm. In other words, scientists in a specific field tend to write their textbooks with bias, affecting and altering the history of that field. Once the history is rewritten, the scientist will inevitably disguise not only the role, but also the existence and significance of the revolutions that got the field to where it is. More often than not, these textbooks contain very little history at all. In the rewritten history, earlier scientists are represented as having worked on the same set of problems and following the same set of fixed canons that the most recent revolution has made seem scientific. The modern method of using science allows these scientists and historians to influence scientific culture and eliminate information that they find discrediting. The knowledge and facts of a generation of scientific grandeur have been substantially altered and rewritten to the point where fact has become separate from truth. It is necessary to clarify the differences between truth and fact. Truth is absolute and unchanging facts. The truth remains true, independent of what humans know or believe. Facts, however, are allegedly known and believed truths, and are dependent on human understanding. Science uses facts to explain occurrences, so if the evidence for a phenomenon changes, so does the fact. For example, in the days after Aristotle, spontaneous generation was an alleged truth. Spontaneous generation was the theory that living organisms could originate from inanimate objects. A few examples of this belief are maggots arising out of rotten meat, fleas originating from dust, and mice coming from bread left in a dark corner. This theory is comically absurd to the modern man, but it was universally accepted for nearly 2,000 years. In 1668, Francesco Redi disproved spontaneous generation by demonstrating that maggots arose from the eggs of flies rather than directly from rotting meat. He did this by taking several jars and placing raw meat inside of them. He left half of the jars to the environment, and the other half he covered with gauze, making it impossible for the flies to lay their eggs inside. This paradigm eventually shifted, and the scientific fact shortly became a common absurdity. What we may hold as fact today may be held as an absurdity tomorrow. Common knowledge changes from generation to generation as scientists make new discoveries and disprove old ones. 20th century philosopher Karl Popper argued in this direction, claiming that knowledge is created by assumptions and criticism and not through reasonable induction. He argued that science does not use induction. He argued that the main role of observations and experiments in science is to criticize and refute existing theories. In other words, rather than trying to prove theories true, scientists try to falsify them. According to Popper, you cannot prove a theory true, but only offer a better explanation to a hypothesis than a previously accepted theory does. Popper famously said, "Science does not rest upon solid bedrock. The bold structure of its theories rises, as it were, above a swamp. It is like a building erected on piles. The piles are driven down from above into the swamp, but not down to any natural or given base. And if we stop driving the piles deeper, it is not because we have reached firm ground. We simply stop when we are satisfied that the piles are firm enough to carry the structure, at least for the time being." The image that Popper presents is one of a structure constantly sinking, replacing its lost material with new layers that will hopefully endure long enough to find more material to add onto it. We cannot trust this structure because it has no foundation. Just like this sinking structure, the modern view of science has no foundation to uphold its beliefs. We cannot put full trust in modern science or consider it an absolute authority. God remains the only absolute authority, and we can learn all that we need to know about the world from his word. God created us to worship and glorify him, and learning about the world he created is essential in doing so. But the methods of modern science gravitate towards glorifying and worshiping men and their exploits rather than God and his. We need to amend our understanding of science to how God meant for us to understand it. Modern science explains occurrences to either attempt to make our lives easier or even just because we can explain them. In contrast, the Bible establishes symbols throughout its word by using different occurrences within God's creation as its examples. We can read these examples, recognize them as we see them in the world, understand their meaning, and apply them to our lives. For example, modern science defines an ant as an insect of the order Hymenoptera, living in a colony of other ants and ruled over by a queen. Modern science would go further to explain their genetics, their means of communication, and their contribution to the ecosystem. But a full understanding of an ant emerges once we read Proverbs 6 through 11. There we see that an ant symbolizes the hard workers that men should be. God blesses us with these examples of good Christian attributes that happen all around us within nature's bounds. From reading his word, we can gain an understanding of the world that modern seculars never will. The methods of modern science can, however, be very useful in understanding God's creation. By using the methods of modern science, we can explain a very great number of things, and we can explain them well. But, as previously mentioned, modern science addresses only those things to which we can assign measurements or numbers. Modern science can tell us that the acceleration due to gravity is 9.8 meters per second. It can explain the physical processes of food digestion and how the small intestine absorbs nutrients and sends them off to the bloodstream, which, in doing so, keeps our bodies healthy. Modern science can tell us the exact number of electrons in an ounce of gold. Modern science is very good at what it does, explaining the material world in its measurable form. But you cannot just rely on the material and measurable things. The world is made up of much more than material. Even discounting the existence of God and his angels, many things hold great meaning to us, and they have no material substance. For example, the very concepts of mathematics and measuring are immaterial. You cannot see, feel, or do the number 5. The closest thing that numbers can get to taking material form is when we represent them with certain symbols or quantities of objects. The principles of logic and reason take on no material form either, yet we make use of them, or attempt to, on a daily basis. Another example of an immaterial concept that we commonly employ is the idea of love. This concept is unmeasurable. Can you measure your love for your mother? You may be able to rate that love on a scale or draw it on a graph, but you cannot truly determine the quantity of it. Modern science would define all emotions as chemical reactions within the brain. The feelings of lust and attraction cause surges of feel-good chemicals to rush through the body, causing the butterflies in the stomach effect. Other emotions cause different mood-altering chemicals to spread, and scientists would say that these chemicals define emotions. Scientists may be correct in claiming that a chemical reaction occurs, but the stimulation of chemicals in the brain does not define emotions, just as humans are much more than just large clumps of cells. Emotions are the feelings that we experience as a result of these chemicals and an infinite number of external sources, including weather, music, peers, etc. When you begin to confine complicated patterns and things to basic and simple occurrences, those things begin to lose their meaning. We also search for metaphysical aspects in friends and spouses. We choose our partners based on our similar interests, the connections we feel with them, and the feelings we get when we're around them. You would not ask a possible partner about their biological data, such as blood type, weight, or genetic code. That companion's physical looks and size may play a part in your overall opinion of them, but how would you explain those opinions materialistically? Opinions themselves are metaphysical and similar to the principles of logic and reason. Modern scientists will attempt to limit these metaphysical ideas to materialistic causes. The occurrences that modern scientists cannot find a way to account for are completely disregarded and made out to be non-existent. The scientists can claim what they want to about God's non-existence, but they have convinced themselves of something that they once knew to be false. As Romans 1:19 through 20 tells us, what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Fully knowing deep down that God exists, they damage their souls with the neglect of his goodness. They turn to their scientific research and use theories that they hope to be true and calculated but relatively unpredictable constants. According to their logic, a being will eventually evolve and change into something new. If this alteration occurs within a biological species, then it must be possible for other spheres of reality to transform into different states, spheres such as the constants of physics. Modern students of the Scientological religion have clouded their judgment enough to place their full trust in a belief stuck in a pattern of everlasting change. They have replaced the stone idols of the ancient peoples with this scientific law. As Thomas Kuhn pointed out, paradigm shifts occur constantly within the field of scientific pursuit, and those who promote novel ideas attempt to discard and cover up any trace of the previous conjecture. Modern scientists, in their promotion of scientism, have attempted to blot out any mark of Christianity within the field. They have even gone so far as to argue that science disproves the existence of any supreme being and that you cannot be a scientist without being an atheist or agnostic. In reality, the opposite is true. All scientists must believe in God to correctly do their work. Scientists depend not only on familiar regularities and constants, but also on the assumption that more constants can be found. These scientific regularities, known as scientific laws, are where God can be seen. Calculating these God-ordained laws is the closest thing that the modern scientific methods of research can get to arriving at the truth. Only God is absolute truth and all-knowing. Christians believe this, and therefore they are the only ones who truly understand the world. The pattern of understanding that God set forth has been twisted to glorify man instead of God. This pattern, which we call science, has been elevated to the status of a god in the eyes of the men and women who study it. Because of the unpredictability of science and the flaws of men, we should not place as much trust or assurance in its results as we commonly do. Instead, we should learn about the world primarily from the Bible, the true Word of God made manifest and acceptable to us. By studying God's Word, we can learn more about the created cosmos than we ever could by merely observing the natural world. Thank you.
Jump right to the question that I have. Okay. You talked about how the Bible shapes the pursuit of science. Could you give an example of how Scripture is going to govern a Christian scientist rather than, or how a secular scientist might differ in their approaches to what they're doing, or the questions they're pursuing?
Yeah, so a Christian scientist can see the end result of the world in salvation, and whereas a secular scientist, there's not really a purpose for it. They're kind of a secular scientist will study science and study the world to make life easier now, but there's really no purpose. As Christians, we study science, first of all, because God told us to. Second of all, because it glorifies God in studying his creation. And third of all, the more we know about science and the world around us, the more we can know about God. Does that answer your question?
One or two other questions? Go ahead.
You're saying Aristotle did not really understand the world?
No, I'm saying he understood the world as it was, as his technology allowed it. So back then, when so with the whole scientific revolutions, they understand it, and when they are adding on to science, when they're discovering their science, they offer an explanation that will last until another explanation that is better is presented. So with as the quote that I read from Karl Popper, with the structure constantly sinking and being added onto, Aristotle was offering the best explanation they could use at the time, and with the knowledge made accessible to them at the time.
Follow up to that one. Would you say, do you think we have more accurate truth that we know in science today than we did, say, 1,000 years ago? Of man's knowledge, let's say, percentage-wise, do you think we know more accurately and truthfully than we did 1,000 years ago when they were using leeches and such way back then?
Well, I'd say it depends on the field. In the field of medicine, we are definitely much more advanced today. But in the field of actually understanding the world, I'd say we're less so, because back then they relied more on the Bible because they didn't have the egotistical view that we can control the world. And in my non-edited thesis, there is a section that I talked about how the serpent, the first sin was the serpent gave them the feeling of power. He caused them to want and desire power, more power. And that's the trap that scientists fall into today. Is we learn more about the world, we make ourselves like God, we make ourselves gods. That's kind of what's pushing them, is we can conquer the world now because we know everything about it. But back then, it was more of the idea that, we need to know how to build a fire to survive. We need, penicillin. Mold makes penicillin, and that can cure. With medical and everything else, it was kind of based on not only survival but more glorification of God, because it was pre-Enlightenment. Does that answer your question?
All right, thank you, Ivan.
Yes, sir.
Sorry, we're going to have to move fast, but their work is far more in depth than they're able to present here, so I encourage you to find them later and ask questions, because they have plenty more to offer. Next, we have Lauren Cross. Her thesis title is Food and History. Please welcome Lauren.
So, in modern day America, there are many strong opinions on what food should look like and the way we should eat it. There are thousands of different diets and plenty of philosophies about food. To help put this dilemma in perspective, I studied a few of the major changes in the culinary world starting in the late Middle Ages, roughly around the 13th to 14th centuries. I couldn't hit every food fad, but I tried to at least tackle a few of the big ones so that I could apply it to modern day America. So without further ado, let's begin. In the late Middle Ages, if it tasted good, it was most likely healthy for you to consume. The medievals weren't simpletons. They simply believed in enjoying God's creation, and to the common man, this applied directly to food. The higher class at the time followed the writings from the school of Salerno on how they should eat. For them, food not only had to taste good, it had to fit with their social status and level out their humors. The status of food items were determined by how close each thing was to the heavens. If it was close to the heavens, then it was viewed as closer to God. The order started with the things of the earth and then moved on to the things of the sea, creatures of the air, and ended with the mythological creatures that came from fire. The original hierarchy of food items did not include beasts of the field, but in Food, A Culinary History, Alan J. Greco adds them right above the sea creatures. He includes these three meats in ascending order: pork, mutton, and veal. All possible food items were thus divided by the four elements: earth, water, air, and fire. This is tied to what they thought about the four humors. They believed one's health relied on the balance of the four humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. They tied black bile to earth and said it was cold and dry. They thought of phlegm as related to water, which they classified as cold and wet. Blood was connected to air and thought of as warm and wet, and yellow bile was a fire. They called it warm and dry. And because the medievals classified food in relation to the four elements, they found it easy to decipher which food the patient should eat if their humors became unbalanced. According to Albert Sonnenfelden's A Culinary History of Food, all physicians and physicists all agreed on three main groups for the 9 basic flavors: hot, which included acrid, bitter, and salty; temperate, which included oily, sweet, and insipid, which is like bland or muted; and cold, which included sour, austere, which is acidic and lacking in depth; and acerbic, which is sour and bitter. The hot foods were considered part of earth and fire elements. The temperate flavors listed above were in the air category, but oily and sweet foods could also fit into the fire category. All cold flavors were thought of as from the earth. Acrid was seen as the most desirable flavor because it was said to have been best for your digestion. Today we know the acrid flavor as spicy or pungent. To the Middle Ages, spicy or hot was the flavor of any aromatic plant. The spicy food was thought to have heated up one's stomach, helping cook and process the food internally. It was classified as warm and dry. Spices were used to warm up and level out the colder foods so that they would be tastier and easier to digest. This being said, they weren't exactly Louisianians. The high class left truly spicy things to the peasants, like garlic, pepper, and mustard and stuff like that. Many writers claim that salt, while greatly improving the taste of a dish, also soaked up undesired moisture. It served as another great leveler to a dish. Another thing that is different from today is the way they use sugar. In the Middle Ages, they thought that sugar was a great medicine for the sick. In fact, they thought that all good food had a hint of sweetness in it. If it was sweet, it had the potential to be spicy. For example, a banana at the very beginning of its life, when it's still green, would be considered acerbic, which is a cold flavor. After a short period of time, the banana grows sweeter. This is caused by the heat in the sun. If someone cooks or bakes the banana, the sugars would crystallize and the banana would become even sweeter. Now, if the banana is burnt, the taste would then become a form of acrid. This is the type of acrid that describes pungency. And even though they thought sugar was good for medicinal purposes, they did not recommend that a healthy person eat it all the time. The scientists at the time thought it best if everyone treated it like a medicine and only ate a lot of it when they got sick. It was considered the most temperate of all the flavors. Doctors were careful to avoid spicy foods when cooking for the sick. This was because they were afraid the hot food would make the fever more intense. Old recipes showed that the sick were given boiled food instead of roasted food and would never be allowed any seasoning on their meal other than sugar. Another medicinal help of the time was sauces. Albert Sonnenfelden quotes Magninus of Milan, Regimen Sanitatis, which states that sauces are of no small value in a healthy diet because condiments make food more delectable to the taste and therefore more digestible. For what is more delectable is better for digestion. Condiments add nutritional value and correct harmful properties. Here we can plainly see that taste and science went hand in hand, searching for the most glorious way to produce and eat food. The next thing on the list happened around the 1500s. When Columbus sailed the blue in 1492, he came back with a plant called teosinte. Because I don't have a lot of time, I'll spare you the details on how this plant became a huge yellow one that we know as corn. But long story short, the colonists bred a plant which completely relied on man for both survival and reproduction. While it was bigger and tastier than teosinte, their corn lacked tryptophan, which caused a massive outbreak of niacin deficiency in the areas which heavily depended on corn. Some believe that this disease is the cause of vampire myths, but I have my doubts. There are many people who are horrified at the amount of corn used in modern American society because of how unnatural and genetically modified it is. They propose that corn production and consumption be reduced. This concern about rapid production points to a change in goals. Before, corn growers tried their hardest to produce enough for them to live off of. Now, we are well provided for, and our concern tends to live in the opposite direction, eating too much. There were a few culinary fads that brought this shift in goals. A significant change came with the invention of the restaurant. The word restaurant is rumored to have originated from a man named Boulanger, which means baker. He lived in Paris in the year of 1765. Boulanger sold soups and bouillon cubes in a small shop in Paris near the Louvre. He called these cubes restaurants because they were meant to restore his customers' strength. Once his shop began to grow in popularity, the Catering Guild noticed that Boulanger had never joined their group and had not paid the fees required to become part of a guild. The Catering Guild, composed of upper-class chefs that worked for aristocrats, filed a lawsuit against Boulanger, but the courts ruled in favor of the peasant baker. With the revolution at the doorstep, the guild was forced to rethink its laws and operations of business toward the people. Restaurants owned by peasants slowly appeared throughout all of France, especially in Paris. Unlike taverns and inns, restaurants focused solely on food, provided only private tables, had fixed hours for operation, a menu given at the beginning of the meal, and a ticket at the end of the meal. During the French Revolution, the number of restaurants grew in France. Chefs that had served aristocratic families before were now forced to open their own shops. It is thought that there were around 100 restaurants before the Revolution, 500 to 600 after the Revolution, and 3,000 during the Restoration of France. For the first time, peasants could experience exquisite food. Food now shifted to the center of French communities. With that came the first organized cookbook, written by Antonin Carême. He is credited with bringing the culinary world out of the Middle Ages. The next major chef was Auguste Escoffier. He brought about the high-end hotels, such as the original Carlton and the Ritz, and wrote one of the most famous guidebooks to a professional kitchen. These cookbooks were aimed at those who already had a good deal of culinary experience. So while the knowledge of cooking wasn't yet broken open for the public, it was a lot easier to access. Escoffier did what he could to bridge the gap in another area. In his memoirs, Escoffier states, "Over the course of my career, I have sewn some 2,000 cooks around the world." In his teachings, he always taught that French cooking, equipment, and personnel was always the best way to start a kitchen. He is one of the reasons why French cooking is viewed as the best form of cooking today. Years of dedicated work, sacrifice, and love to both the world of food and their fellow man went into the writings of Antonin Carême and Auguste Escoffier. Ultimately, we can see that service, not pride, is what cultivates good cooking. While Escoffier taught chefs how to construct a meal, Americans were finding value in the chemicals found in food. In early 1900s, the craze over vitamins was surging through America. Every food producer broadcasted their vitamin-rich products. This roaring craze died down once World War II began. During World War II, almost all of the red meat was sent to the front lines to strengthen the troops. This left fish, chicken, and unwanted parts from various animals for the majority of the people to come back home. Casseroles became a great vehicle for unwanted meats and a cheap way to serve chicken. It was kind of like the modern-day chicken nugget. Casseroles have always been a dish among common people, and believe it or not, the first recipe we have for a casserole was in 1250 AD. This recipe was written in Latin and was a recipe for macaroni and cheese. The word casserole came from the French word cassa and the Latin word catia, meaning to ladle. Originally, these words referred to the bowl or plate everyone shared at the table. Food that was served in these dishes were normally different types of pasta and was a common meal in Italy for many years. After World War II, it was the convenience of this meal that made it such a hit in the 50s and 60s. It was around this time that the first French cookbook was written for the masses. Julia Child not only taught wonderful French cuisine from their bookshelves, but she also showed them exactly how to do things herself on the television. After the war, the majority of America's population wanted easy meals. All of the culinary industry recognized this and marketed gadgets and recipes that could simplify life in the kitchen. And even though the population wanted ease, they also wanted a sign of the ideal abundance after rations in the war. Food sizes and quantities increased rapidly. Food producers injected hundreds of newly developed additives to their processed products. Supermarkets appeared across the country, and the shelves were stocked with preserved, pre-cooked food items in packages. Convenience was key. Vitamins or complicated recipes were no longer the primary goals. Instead, the family needed a quick way to prepare a wholesome meal after getting home from work. The microwave had just been invented by Percy LeBaron Spencer using radar systems from the war. And until the 1960s, microwaves were the size of refrigerators and were too expensive for the average American. But when improved, this little oven catered to solitary eaters and promoted a quick and easy life, a sizable leap from the fellowship which comes from eating off the same plate. Women who wanted to go to work the next day, approximately 32% of the workforce, favored the microwave and another invention called the slow cooker. Today we know them by the brand named crockpots. This device was wildly convenient and only required the cook to dump in the desired ingredients. After that, the machine would cook it for you. The Washington Post stated that it was perfect for working women. With the expansion of cities and the increasing female workforce, fast food restaurants grew in popularity. Those traveling on the ever-increasing highways would stop in for a meal, and those who worked a good way from home spent their lunch break in the fast food place nearby. Meanwhile, Julia Child pushed back and encouraged home cooks to be adventurous in their cooking. She believed in working hard, making good food, and using good ingredients. In 1971, Alice Waters opened Chez Panisse in California and led the charge of the farm-to-table movement. It encouraged cooks to use fresh ingredients instead of processed ones. The farm-to-table movement promised better dishes as the product of better ingredients. This movement is still in full swing and is supported by many restaurants of all kinds. Among those are haute restaurants. Haute means high, and it refers to high-end dining. People often associate it with snobbishness, but it isn't all bad. One of the largest parts of haute cuisine today is a trend called molecular gastronomy. It heavily involves chemical reactions and new technology. It also has drawn many of its inspirations from modern art. One of the men held responsible for the shift is Ferran Adria, owner and head chef at El Bulli, along with his brother Albert Adria. El Bulli was a restaurant in Spain which was started in the 1960s. If you have ever seen a savory ingredient turned into foam, you can blame him for it. Also, he was the first one to come up with spherification, which can change sauces or any type of liquid into a sphere, so that's all him. And one of the last trends worth noting is Harvey A. Levenstein calls the negative nutrition movement. It began somewhere after World War II, but it really hit its stride in the 1970s. Instead of recommending nutritious food, this trend concentrated on staying away from harmful food that might compromise the body. It disapproved of sugar, cholesterol, fat, and many other things. At first, the health organizations publishing these statements made deals with wealthy food companies to help them sell their new products. But as this trend caught on, more legitimate studies were conducted. Many of these studies had contradicting outcomes, and those outcomes have been disproven and corrected today. For example, in the 60s and 70s, eggs were viewed as a terrible thing to eat due to their cholesterol. Now we acknowledge that eggs could cause problems if eaten too often, but are a great source of iron and vitamins. Today we have many diets that contradict each other. Following the pattern of history, most of the large popular diets will be trends. As long as we remember that food is meant to be a blessing to our bodies and to the others around us, we can follow the trending food movement. Most of all, enjoy the food, enjoy your people, and enjoy your God. Thank you.
A couple questions? Yes.
I think like the bigger size ones, but they weren't ever like huge. Yeah.
Pastor Will.
I'm not really sure where the connection first began of food and health, and I'm not sure like where like the modern idea was pulled from. I know that like obviously a lot of the ideas are very different, but yeah, I would say that the craze of putting so much weight on diets and stuff, because for the Middle Ages, it was really just like the highest class that really thought about that sort of thing. So most of the peasants were really just working to eat each day. So I think today it's based on how much food we have, so that's more available to us, and our idea that we can extend our life by doing something to ourselves or keeping up our bodies better. So.
My question is kind of similar. We see in, it seems that the earth, water, air, fire, that's oriented to ascend into heaven, so things closer to God or the gods is better. Sweetness seems to fit with that, that being at the top of the medieval taste, where God is sweet. Do you see connection between how God is viewed and the shift in our fads?
Well, I know like today we're not really, like we're, I guess, more the remains of a Christian culture. So we have a lot more, especially in our scientific realm of food, a lot more as man is God. So it's a lot more managing. So we're trying to manage our health and weight and how we feel and our moods and everything, which is fine. Like if you have a problem which you know can be fixed by something, like go for it. But I think the idea that it's within our power and within our grasp to fix it, that is definitely more man-centered. So.
Anything else? One more? All right, thank you, Lauren. We spend all year talking about when you're speaking, speak slow and clearly, and then we pack them all in so they have to speed up. So thank you for accommodating the schedule. Grace Bailey is our next presenter. Her title is The Importance of Folk Music in the Church. Welcome, Grace.
Music has always played an important role in the corporate life of the church. While worship, as defined by the Bible, is much more than just singing and music, it is clear that those elements are gifts of God designed to play a crucial role. What the singing and music should be characterized by has been the topic of much debate in various times of church history. In this paper, I argue for the importance of folk music in the spiritual life and growth of the church. Before getting into the details of what is meant by folk music, it is important to establish the centrality of music itself for God's people. The Christian religion is a singing religion. It's very hard to talk about it without mentioning the central role music plays in Christianity. Even from the beginning, after God had safely delivered the Israelites from the Red Sea, the people sang songs to the Lord, Exodus 15. Singing became part of Israel's worship in both the tabernacle and the temple. The Psalms tell us that whether in sorrow, joy, fear, praise, or lament, the faithful always lift up their voices to God. The Apostle Paul, in Colossians 3:16-17, says to let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. Music is a gift from God that was included in the creation he made. In Job 38:7, God asked Job if he was present at creation when the morning stars sang together and the heavenly beings shouted for joy. The Apostle John points to the new creation when every creature on heaven and on earth and under the earth and under the sea and all that is in them will sing to the Lamb on the throne. Revelation 5:13. This just goes to show us the created world is musical. When we make music, we are participating in the music of creation and reflecting the diversity and beauty of God's glory in the new creation. This may explain why people's lives are surrounded by music. In fact, music can be found in every culture and people group throughout human history. Today, there is more access to music for the individual than at any other time. Whether on the radio, in a movie, in the store, or on your phone, music has become the background noise of our lives. If music is embedded in the fabric of creation and in the hearts of God's people, and if it is to be central in the worship of the church, then what should characterize its content and form? One would have to admit that the music of the church has a wide range of diversity throughout its history. From the ancient Hebrew Psalms to medieval chants to modern hymns, there have been many expressions of praise and proclamation. This is also true as one looks at the multicultural aspects of music and singing from hundreds of people around the world. Wherever the gospel has been preached and the Spirit has planted churches, there has arisen new voices adding to the one voice of the saints. The people of God sing, but what they sing is one of the most important issues. Webster defines folk music as the traditional music of the people in a country or region. The Oxford Dictionary adds that it originates in the popular culture of a particular people and is passed down from generation to generation. Taken together, I am defining folk music here as music that originates in a common history or story of a people, reflects the unique flavors of the culture in which it develops, and is passed down to future generations, who also add to the tradition with new expressions of the same history or story. In other words, folk music finds its source in the redemptive story of God's people and the truths of God's word, and expresses these realities in culturally relevant ways that can be passed down to their children and their children's children. But greater variety and options in music also calls for greater discernment within the church. In looking at the ways in which the apostles instructed and guided the New Testament churches, there is a strong unity and core identity built upon the whole of the Scripture as it is fully revealed in Jesus Christ and the good news proclaimed. But there is also a wonderful freedom and diversity in its structure that allows for the church to transcend cultures and times while still remaining firmly rooted in the world. The particularities of the worship in the tabernacle and the temple are transformed through Christ into principles that can help guide the church in her worship so that the purpose and meaning is not lost. This is part of what Jesus is revealing to the Samaritan woman as he addresses her question about whether proper worship is conducted on Mount Gerizim or Mount Zion. He answers her by saying, "But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers." John 4:23. The Psalms themselves were born out of the people's experiences and found their expression in the cultural Hebraic expressions of the time. Even the high musical genius of Bach was composed in the common language of the day and in a musical style that was familiar to the ears of the people to whom it blessed. This music continued to resonate with future generations even as language and style evolved. To its heritage, new language and new flavors of music were added. In saying that the Bible gives a freedom of worship to the church as it grows and expands is not the same as saying every song or piece of music is appropriate for corporate worship. The church has often made distinctions throughout its history of what should be sung, preserved, and passed on through the creation of hymnals. A journey through just a few of the many hymnals will show this process in action, where some songs serve their purpose and fade away, others continue on for several generations, and others are newly added to the refrain. Language is adapted, tunes are reworked or replaced. Each generation takes up the voice of the previous one and also finds ways to add their unique voice to the songs of the redeemed. We have established that singing is an essential part of Christian worship, and it should be done corporately in a way that gleans wisdom from the types and shadows of the Old Covenant, builds continuity for the people of God across generations, and yet both reflects and transcends ethnic and cultural roots. Folk music is the kind of earthy music that can encompass past, present, and future in a way that allows the church to grow in grace and love in its worship to God. There are 5 principles I am going to mention that we should keep in mind for the use of folk songs in worship. First, love is indispensable to church singing that pleases God. Music itself shouldn't be the glue that holds us all together. Our identity in Christ and the power of the Holy Spirit should be our bond. John Calvin addresses this very issue with humility and wisdom. The quote, "But because he, the Lord, did not will an outward discipline and ceremonies to prescribe in detail what we ought to do, because he foresaw that this depended upon the state of the times, and he did not deem one form suitable for all ages. Here we must take refuge in those general rules which he has given, that whatever the necessity of the church will require for order and decorum should be tested against these. Lastly, because he has taught nothing specifically, and because these things are not necessary to salvation, and for the upbuilding of the church ought to be variously accommodated to the customs of each nation and age, it will be fitting, as the advantage of the church will require, to change and abrogate traditional practices and to establish new ones. Indeed, I admit that we ought not to change into innovation rashly, suddenly, for insufficient cause, but love will best judge what may hurt or edify, and if we let love be our guide, all will be safe. We shouldn't be quick to judge others' worship music just because it's different from what we think it should be. Our musical preferences should never become the standard by which we judge the appropriateness of music in the corporal worship gathering. We must be careful to measure others' worship music by the Scripture, being careful to let Scripture guide us as well as keep love at the center of how we view and discuss these issues. Where God's Word gives clear principles for corporate worship, we should not seek greater liberty. This will cause us to love certain songs or musical styles more than we love God. At the same time, where God's Word gives liberty and room for diversity, we should not place extra limitations. This will cause us to love certain traditions and genres more than we love our fellow worshipers of Christ. The church is an unshakable kingdom that is bigger than certain times and cultures. No matter when or where we are gathered as his people, we are still praising the Lord of all, with thankfulness in our hearts to God, Colossians 3:16. This leads to the second principle. Our singing is for God's glory and for the edification of Christ's body. The person we want to honor most is God. The question is not what pleases me or other people, but what pleases him. If it pleases God, then it will also edify his people. The Psalms frequently direct our singing to God. For example, Psalm 95 begins with the command, "O come, let us sing to the Lord, let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation." In Psalm 104, the psalmist confesses, "I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have being." At the same time, this singing to God also has a corporate nature. When Paul and Silas were imprisoned for their gospel preaching, Luke records that about midnight they were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them, Acts 16:25. We see this two-way direction of singing in passages such as Psalm 105:2, "Sing to him, sing praises to him, tell of all his wondrous works." Or consider Ephesians 5:19, where Paul exhorts the believers to address one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with your heart. Congregational song is part of the teaching of the church. As we seek to please the Lord and glorify him with our singing, we must also consider what our songs and music communicates to the people around us about this God whom we praise. Pastors and worship leaders alike should always ask themselves what the people in the church would learn if they learned their theology from the music being sung on Sunday. This doesn't mean that every song has to be fully developed theology in it. Songs are not sermons or commentaries, but even the simplest song must reflect the beauty and glory of God and the gospel story woven throughout the whole Bible. The third principle of church music is to sing to the Lord new songs. If we had stopped writing songs and hymns to God in the 15th century, then we wouldn't have a mighty fortress. If we had stopped in the 16th century, then there would be no Isaac Watts. If we had even stopped a generation ago, we would have lost the hymn in Christ alone. There is no way to determine when the last good hymn or song has been written. As long as the church thrives, good hymns will filter their way through. Fourth, church music should swim in its own history of singing. This interesting metaphor was made by Kevin DeYoung. He says that we should swim in this great ocean of music, always receiving new streams and still swimming in the old, not closing ourselves in a small pool of only contemporary music. It would be folly to think that we have nothing good to gain from the old hymns and nothing to lose when we throw out songs Christians have been singing for hundreds of years. There are so many benefits from singing the hymns. People try to argue against the hymns that there's not enough diversity, but hymns have about 20 centuries of music styles, chants, folk tunes, carols, psalms. This is not to say that every hymn is good. Plenty of bad hymns have been written, but over time they seem to be weeded out slowly but surely. Fifth, the Psalms are important for the church and everyone in it. It's crazy how the whole middle section of the Bible is so easily ignored by churches all over the world. We are reminded over and over again of how essential the Psalms are. not only in our worship, but also in our daily lives. Being the children of God means we will undoubtedly be put on trial and face persecution in some form or another. And what better way to remind ourselves of God's mercy and grace than by singing the Psalms in those trials? This means the church should also make sure the Psalms play a central role in its singing, from chanting to metrical psalms to songs that reflect their heart and content. One thing to remember in all this is that singing belongs to all the people of God. It is a gift he has given us for our good, and we are to return it back to him in humble gratitude. As John Calvin once again notes, the chief use of the tongue was for public prayers, which are offered in the assembly of believers, by which it comes about that with one common voice, as it were, with the same mouth, we all glorify God together, worshiping him with one spirit in the same faith. Let us remember that our tongues were created by God to praise and glorify his name, both through singing and speaking. A church which is deprived of congregational singing will suffer tremendously, along with the faith of everyone in it. Songs from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation will join together in one glorious harmony, and the church builds itself up in love. The Bible says that we should use instruments in worship, so I guess just on that.
Other questions? Do we have something from the voice above? Grace, G.K. Chesterton was talking about professionalization of the arts, mentioned that what has happened is fewer people sing just for the absurd reason that one person can sing better than the others. Do you see the professionalization of singing as having a negative effect on the community of singing? Or what would you say to address that problem?
Can you ask that one more time?
How professionalism, where people who sing professionally, they spend the time singing and communal singing has decreased. How would you address that problem? Or encourage a community to turn?
I don't know how to answer that right now.
It's hard to do it on your feet. Well, thank you for your presentation, Greg. I usually have the advantage of reading the thesis before they're presented, but for these next two, I don't have that advantage. Cameron Lang is presenting Tyranny and Culture for us.
The American colonies, before it became its own country, fought for freedom from a corrupt English Parliament. The English Parliament were taxing the colonists on multiple items that were being traded and sold. The problem was that even though the colonists were being taxed, they didn't have a say in what the tax dollars were used for, because Britain viewed them as a separate part of England and not actually a part of England themselves. In England, each city would get X amount of representatives in the House of Parliament, but since the 13 colonies weren't a part of the main island of Great Britain, they weren't allowed to have any representation in the House of Parliament. This made the colonies not too happy, because they paid taxes to the government that didn't even look after the colonists, because they didn't have representatives in the House. So England was making money off the country that really supported itself and that didn't need any protection from England. So the British government
was not protecting the colonists or protecting their rights, but were still taxing and profiting off of them. So naturally, the 13 colonies started to draw the line and began to stop paying any taxes. The British did not like this, so they sent troops to help persuade them, and by forcing them, but the Americans fought them and became their own country. Was this tyranny for Britain to tax the colonists? First, we define tyranny. Tyranny is a cruel, oppressive government or rule. That is unreasonably overstepping their authority. Unreasonably overstepping their authority, meaning they overstep the limits of a system or situation. They do something that is not allowed or is not acceptable. Now, was Parliament overstepping their authority and oppressing the colonists? Yes, Parliament could not tax the colonies because Parliament was over the island of England, and because the 13 colonies did not have representation in the House, this was an unreasonable request for the House of Parliament to give. All that's left is asking whether or not they were oppressive. And again, the answer is yes. The British sent soldiers to the colonies not to protect them, but to force them to cooperate with the taxes. And when the British soldiers came over to the colonists, they were forced to quarter the soldiers in their homes. This was put in place by the British and was known as the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act required all colonial authorities to provide food, drink, quarters, fuel, and transportation to any British forces stationed in their towns or villages. You can see how this could make some people mad, because not only do each colonialist family have to provide for their families, but also for the extra soldiers in their town. This could mean giving up their children's room in order to let a soldier sleep, or giving up their own meal for the British forces. Was it a good way of responding to the British by going to war? Well, where it started was with the Stamp Act, which was before the Quartering Act, and the Stamp Act imposed a tax on legal documents, newspapers, tea, even playing cards. This was the first direct tax on the American colonists and was resisted immediately. In resisting the act, it was eventually repealed and gave the colonists confidence to avoid any taxing in the future. After this, the British sent soldiers to Boston in order to keep the colonists from not paying their tax. But this was met with resistance again. There were many street fights between the soldiers and colonists. One of these fights ended in 5 people dead. This is known as the Boston Massacre. After this, the colonists came up with their own system to respond to the British colonial policy. This was called the Committees of Correspondence. This led to Parliament passing the Intolerable Acts. These acts closed down the Boston port and made it mandatory for their taverns and vacant homes to be given to the British soldiers for housing. Immediately following this, the colonists made an impromptu army known as the Minutemen. They began stockpiling guns, ammunition, and gunpowder in Concord and Lexington. On April 19, 1775, the war began. 2 battles, one in Concord and one in Lexington. The colonists won the war in 1777 and finally were free from the tyrannical government of Britain. Tyranny is a cruel, unreasonable, oppressive government or rule. What does that look like? Well, there are 3 rights that our forefathers put in the Constitution when building our nation's laws. These rights or ideas that I will discuss are most likely for an oppressive government to take over and are a clear sign that our country is under a tyrannical leadership. These rights were put in place to make the United States of America a country who puts God as their leader. These rights fall under a bigger category, and that is that God created all men. Those rights fall under this that are the right to live, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The three rights that are what the laws of our nation are based on, and were made specifically in order to protect these rights. I will tackle these three rights. The first is God gave all men the right to life. This does not mean that no man can take away this right, but under certain circumstances, it is needed to take away this right. For instance, if a man kills another man, he has sacrificed his right to life. But because he has broken the God-given right, and therefore is subject to punishment, even the death penalty. The right is given to every man and can be taken away, but only by extreme cases. This right does not get you anything free just because you are alive. This is not a right to food, for housing, or housing. In fact, God says, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. 2 Thessalonians 3:10. The second right is the right to liberty, meaning the state of being free within a society from oppressive restrictions imposed by an authority in one's way of life. The authority of government cannot place restrictions that affect your ableness to serve the Lord. The third right is the right to pursue happiness, meaning that every man has the right to be free and happy to do whatever he wants, as long as it does not take away others' freedom or happiness. This is the kind of law that is over all the other laws. 1 John 4 says to love others and do as you please. This is the basis of the law, which you are only truly free and happy if you can love others in what you do. How do these laws apply to the tyrannical government or leader in the United States of America? Well, as I previously said, that when a form of tyranny takes over the nation and corrupts it, that country loses its life, liberty, and happiness. When even one of these so-called rights are taken, your ability to serve others, and especially God, becomes compromised. There are also steps that happen before this, but these three are especially the key indicators. Is modern America under a tyrannical rule currently, and if so, from whom? First, when COVID-19 hit, the churches were shut down because of social distancing and mandates. Under no circumstances should the Church of God ever be stopped from teaching the Bible. This is an obvious indication that our government is overstepping their rule. This breaks the second right, our right to liberty, which is the government putting restraints on our beliefs, religion, and our way of life. Second, in our current society, God's not put at our country's front. As a country who allows babies to be killed every day, and we are not believers on the whole. This nation was built on the trust of God, and now it has changed. How did this happen? Schooling. Our government took over the education of our children and teaches nothing about God and Christ saving us. In fact, you can't teach the Bible at a public school. Schools used to be in a church, and the community was very involved with what the children learned, and now it has drastically changed. If a school isn't teaching God's word, then they are teaching some other religion or self-centered. Everyone serves something, whether they serve themselves or a pseudo-God or Jesus. Everyone believes in something. This doesn't necessarily fall under the three rights, but as we can see over and over again in the Bible. When a nation forgets God, the people are always oppressed, and tyrannical rule is always how the people are oppressed. In conclusion, we may not be under a tyrannical rule currently, but if we continue down this path of murdering children and not teaching God's word, we will end up like the nations around us, where God's word is not allowed to be taught anywhere. Breaking God's law and not repenting as a nation is the quickest way to tyranny. To fix and recover, we need to set an example for others, because we are made in Christ's image, and through prayer we can redeem. Thank you.
Any questions? Dad?
No. He can pursue, I said in there that you can pursue anything that makes you happy that is under God's laws and that does not compromise other people's happiness. Yeah, definitely. Well, it was the fact that if they had representation in Parliament, then it wouldn't have been a major problem, because what they were doing was they were just taking their taxes and not putting it back into the colonies. So now we have our own government and electoral thing, which goes, I can't really explain it, but right. Right. Okay. Yeah. That point right there. Yeah, I did.
Mr. Cameron, you mentioned that one of those rights would deprive one of those rights and compromise our ability to serve God. Let's say that I decide to lock you up, I take you into bondage. You're only allowed out to gather straw, make bricks for Bodie Heaney's new palace. Has that compromised your ability to serve God? You're going to have to serve for 20, 30 years doing that.
No, but if your whole country is dedicated to that, and that's the only thing you're allowed to do, so you can't sing, you can't go to church, all you have to do is build Bodie and Ely's palace, then that compromises it.
And compromise meaning unable to serve God.
Not necessarily. They're like Corrie ten Boom. She was still able to serve God in a bad place, and I would say that is under. She was in a concentration camp, which is not free at all. But I'm just saying that it's harder to serve God in that area. Not necessarily that it's not possible. I don't remember from Herodotus. Sorry. Dad probably knows.
Thank you, Kim. And our final presenter is Lunden Lizenby. The title is The Responsibility of Motorists.
Good afternoon. Currently, the responsibility of planning and maintaining America's roadways falls to the state and the local governments. Due to bureaucracy, laziness, and other inefficiencies in our form of governments, the responsibilities that those governmental bodies possess, particularly maintaining our roads, have been neglected or not placed as a priority as they should have been. As Americans, we have one of the largest countries in the world by landmass. Also, as a result of our American ideology of bigger is better, we do not often need or want to live compactly, and most of the time walking or biking is not a smart way of getting around. Another result of our American ideology is that our vehicles are large and in charge, and this directly affects the size of our roads, increasing how long it takes to build and repair them. In my thesis, I will discuss why citizens should take control of roads in their neighborhood from their civil governments. For the purposes of this thesis, a definition of a functioning civil government will be this: the governing body of a functioning city or town which generates income and distributes that wealth to its programs. Programs being things such as, but not limited to, parks, schools, public transportation, and roads. In Exodus 18:21 through 22, it says, "But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them serve as judges for the people at all times, but have them bring every difficult case to you. The simple cases they can decide themselves. That will make your load lighter, because they will share it with you." In this passage, we learn of a wise solution to dealing with the task of taking care of a large group of people. In our current day and age, this tactic is still used in our government, such as the division of federal, state, county or parish, and civil rule. These divisions make the burden of governing a whole country easier and give citizens a chance to interact with their government by making it smaller. While the strategy given to us in Exodus works, we have not followed the proper guidelines to setting it up, and therefore it fails us. Exodus 18:21, "But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain." It can rarely be said that a government official is capable, trustworthy, and hateful of dishonest gain. So, if the officials meant to help the citizens are incapable to lead, then the whole structure must be failing, and the responsibilities put to the officials would probably not succeed. As this is the case, a common matter for jokes is the state of the government, and particularly the work that it does out in the community, such as groundskeeping and general property maintenance. How many times have you seen an overgrown median or a poorly kept ditch next to a highway? Another example of this unreliability is the power grid, which can be seen in the recent growth in generator sales. The company Generac, a leading generator brand, told Reviewed they saw a net sales increase 50% in 2021. Additionally, over the past 20 years, Generac has seen a steady increase in standby generator installations, making it clear that generators are becoming a top priority product for emergency situations. This boom in generator sales is happening due to poor infrastructure and a general distrust of the government's ability to take care of its citizens. The same case can be made for our roads. There are entire states known for having terrible driving conditions, such as Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and California, just to name a few. Now listen to James 2:18. "But someone will say, 'You have faith, and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works.' The government's apparent lack of capable works has shown its lack of faithful Christian leadership in these areas. While the government is an easy target to bash, it is important to remember we need the government to enforce law and order. For example, there was a small libertarian community in New Hampshire that took over a town called Grafton. They had cut its ties with any higher form of government, and as a result, allowed a community of bears, who are also looking for utopia of their own, to take the reins. Matthew Hongoltz Hetling, who wrote the book A Libertarian Walks into a Bear, a book about the Freetown story, said this. I'd put it like this. There's a national community of libertarians that has developed over the last 40 to 50 years, and they've never really had a place to call their own. They've never been in charge of a nation or a state or even a city, and they've always really wanted to create a community that would showcase what would happen if they implemented their principles on a broad scale. So in 2004, a group of them decided that they wanted to take some action on this deficiency, and they decided to launch what they called the Freetown Project. They sent out a call to a bunch of loosely affiliated national libertarians and told everyone to move to this one spot and found this utopian community that would then serve as a shining jewel for the world to see that libertarian philosophies worked, not only in theory, but in practice. And they chose a town in rural New Hampshire called Grafton that already had fewer than 1,000 people in it. And they just showed up and started working to take over the town government and get rid of every rule and regulation and tax expense if they could. These people thought that they could self-regulate and operate with the smallest to no government possible. Their ideal was a small government creating an administrative hole that nobody thought to fill. As a result of this hole, nobody thought to self-govern their hunting practices, and the bears found libertarian flavor to be quite nice. As I explained earlier, this plan was met with failure and only serves to further illustrate our dependence on a higher earthly authority. We can take examples from Israel's history. First, before they had even become a nation, Abraham was roaming around with his own little army. Next, Joseph became the right-hand man to Pharaoh, and the rest of his family moved in under Egyptian rule and eventually became slaves. Next, Israel moves out, and under Moses and the advice of his father-in-law, bureaucracy is born. These times, the Israelites had prophets who had contact with the Lord. God gave them rules and taught them how to conduct themselves. Then, later in the story, the men of Israel rebelled and started to do what was right in their own eyes. When the peoples rebelled, the Lord sent judges, and whenever he did, the people repented, and the state of the nation was renewed. This cycle of rebellion and repentance repeated itself for a while. Then the Israelites had rebelled again and asked for a king. This showed the Lord that the people did not want to follow him, but he gave them a king anyway, giving them this warning. He said, "This is the king who will reign over you, will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run out in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." So from a theocracy to anarchy to monarchy, the common theme between these three being that when Israel and its rulers were faithful, there was usually prosperity and peace. So what is the best way to make sure that our roads are faithfully built, maintained, and financed? I believe the answer is to do it ourselves. Not only do we avoid any inefficiencies in our current system, but we could also control the quality as well. This would also enlarge a private sector of work dedicated to road making, and would also free up the government to do work elsewhere. This solution should not include state-controlled roads like highways or interstates, due to the smaller number of people living on them. And if included in the type of roads that the common citizen should care for, it would be the same system we have currently, just under new jurisdiction. This solution, as I mentioned in the beginning, is meant for neighborhood roads in suburban areas. There also still needs to be some governmental oversight with respect to quality and accessibility. The owners will need to sign public easements and keep the quality to a minimum standard for emergency vehicles. This solution poses a challenge for the poor, who barely have means to live in their own house, much less pay for their own roads. This could be solved by the government taking care of the roads of those neighborhoods, because the government now has less to take care of. The government has proven that it can't be trusted with the responsibility of roads, and therefore we must take the responsibility ourselves. Thank you. No, sorry, I forgot. Didn't clarify that very well. So I mentioned that the owners would have to sign public easements. Public easements being an easement being a document saying that certain people have access to this, and you have no control over this, even though you own it. This happens in realty sometimes. A public easement will mean that anyone can access this. So it would maintain the same amount of accessibility that we have now. So no one would be able to put up toll roads. My idea to how it would be paid for would be boards. You would collect governments selected by the current divisions that there are. You make boards based on neighborhoods and et cetera. Yes, but yes. Yeah. It would be more like an HOA almost. So it would still be citizen controlled, but it would be the same thing as taxes basically. Yes, yes. The reason why I said that is because like I said just now, it's the same thing as taxes, just operated by basically an HOA. And so if you included highways and interstates, you would have to have different boards of different people, which is basically what we have now in our government, bureaucracy. And so it wouldn't lighten the load for anybody. It would just shift the burden to someone else. And we probably still have the same problems. I believe so, yes. How we improve? Yes. So with these new boards and committees over the specific neighborhoods, they would control that with very limited governmental oversight, oversight for only the quality control, so that emergency vehicles may be able to use them, and also with respect to public easements. So these boards would have basically all the responsibility and work, and so the civil government wouldn't have to really worry about it very much. And so that would free up space and time and revenue for the highways and interstates and other things that do not include in here. Mhm. Yes. Yes. Yes.
London, so not all roads have the same amount of traffic. So my road doesn't get nearly as much traffic as Margood would.
Yes.
What would prevent people moving off your road, because that road would be more expensive to maintain than mine? So what happens when people start moving to roads that aren't as well used, so they don't have to pay for the upkeep?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there needs to be a minimum standard for emergency vehicles. You can't get an ambulance down to an end of a road that you can't even drive a normal car down. And so there needs to be constantly a normal amount. So there's not going to be neighborhoods that aren't that are $0 poured into roads. There needs to be a minimum amount of quality control. But with roads like Parker, you said, that are busier, it's just going to be a cost that the citizens are going to have to bite the bullet on. It's just a cost of living closer into town.
So if people leave these main arteries, what happens?
What happens? Real estate boom?
Other questions?
Marion?
So you mentioned cost a lot. So would this
implementation, I don't really cover implementation, and I wasn't really thinking too much about it because it's kind of a whole new can of worms. Because they need to account for, okay, if we do this and we start paying for it, and, start paying the board fees and whatnot, that they take care of it, will the government even let us, or even reduce the taxes that they currently spend on roads? Will they just, keep on taking your money? And so it's kind of an unpredictable factor.
Seems your argument is hard to follow. Broad flow. That we didn't have good men, so we have bad roads, made it works.
Yes.
We need to choose wise men. So would there be those who are controlling that local, is there a way that we get better men because they're local? Or is the nature of man changed as you get more and more local? Or do they,
Yes.
how do we find these better men? It seems like you'd argue that we have bad roads to get bad men. We need good men, but good roads.
So the current structure makes it easier for bad men to hide. And so if I have Joe Schmo living next to me and he's screwing up, then, it's going to be easier for me to nag him.
To be accountable.
The accountability is.
Yes, sir.
So, if, real quick question, the people that live with the public roads, will be paying this committee that's designated over a certain area to maintain the roads, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, if I live on a road and it gets really beaten up and battered, so emergency vehicles can't really travel on it, I'm going to have to pay as a citizen a lot of money to this board to fix this road that I live on. And because that road is not only mine, that's everybody's to drive on. If I own a house, that's mine, right? But if I have to pay for something that, everyone has to drive on. So, and it could not even be my fault. Say there's an accident and the road was poorly made previously and it gets wrecked. I have to, take money out of my account to pay for that. So.
Yes, I see what you're getting at. So in the Bible, I can't remember where, but we learned of this rule that you have to build a fence around the top of your house. That's obviously going to cost money and time, but it's just because, just in case someone goes up there and they fall off, there's accountability there. The same thing goes with the law. You have to build a fence around your pool as being closed, so no one can just wander in and drown. And so even though it is your property, since you were technically paying for it, there is that sense where you have to kind of fork up the dough to make it better for everybody. Also, I mentioned in here public easements. Easements, again, being a document saying that certain people can access this. Public meaning everyone. So everyone can access it, and you don't have any control over that. And so whether or not it is your property, since there's a public easement on it, anybody can go in there.
Thank you, Lunden. Thank you, seniors. Thank you for coming. You're dismissed.